So welcome to the closer look. For the 22nd of November, 2023, we are going to be looking at the unrest potential in the United States for 2024. The agenda is here. You've seen this in your email and you've seen this at the beginning of the briefing, so we won't linger too much, although I will say that there are quite a few similarities between the 2020 unrest and what we're setting up for in 2024. So we'll be making those comparisons pretty closely throughout this presentation. Now, as way of introduction, you may say, why this closer look? Well, we are expecting unrest in the United States in 2024. And for those of you who don't know, at Knightsbridge, we really got our beginning tracking social unrest, tracking, you can call it event tracking, battle tracking, whatever you want to call it. But that's really where we grew into a truly professional and skilled organization, was years back, working with other similar groups and then just our own team and tracking riots, protests in the United States and abroad, for clients, and then sometimes just for our own selves, right? Using those as training tools, et cetera. So this is where we cut our teeth as an organization. And as we have our discussions internally, I think that our analysts are all pretty much in agreement on what we're looking at in 2024. So as part of our efforts to keep you ahead of the curve and keep you informed on not just what is happening, but what is likely to happen, this closer look seemed like a really good idea, just to give you a heads up and some greater insights looking forward. One of the things as well is that, social unrest is always part of the decline of major powers. When empires start to decline, you can talk about really any of them, right? Going all the way back to ancient Egyptian empires, back to the Roman era. You can look at Sparta even. You can look at all these ancient powers, but also more modern ones. And as the decline of empire takes hold, social unrest is a marker in that, that is essentially unbeaten at this point in time, right? When you're starting to get major social unrest within a country, combined with other factors, you kind of know where you are in the cycle of empires. One of the things I did want to get out of the way early is what do you define as unrest, right? We're looking at unrest potential in the United States for the next year. So essentially this, right? We're defining unrest as large scale protest action that involves thousands of individuals at multiple locations taking that action for a cause, right? So something like what you're seeing in the image here, right? That's unrest. That is social unrest. That is a protest that could devolve into a riot as well. But what we're not talking about here, what we're not talking about is small, localized or one-off actions, right? For example, if there is an incident in a city, and that city turns out, a couple of thousand people, and there's a vigil, candlelight vigils, a march, protest, and that's about it, right? It doesn't move into violence. It doesn't become regional in nature or national. Then we're really not calling that unrest, right? That's just a small vigil. But when you see things like this image and it's much wider scale, that's what we're talking about when we're looking at the unrest potential for next year. So as per the agenda, let's look back to 2020. Right, Knightsbridge was heavily involved in tracking a lot of these riots and protests in 2020, and there was a lot of it, right? There was a lot of it in 2020. You saw a lot of the unrest linked to certain political or social causes. The George Floyd riots were a big deal, but that also essentially captured other causes, right? So often when you have protest action, those protesting, that cause may be third on their list, and so they're eventually going to put forth their top cause, right? And it merges, and some protests turn into others, some organizations turn into others, etc. But in 2020, it was political and social and cause-based action. That's what we saw. Now, a lot of the cause, whether it was Donald Trump, protests both for and against. You can see a couple images there. The one on the left anti-Trump from June 2020. You see a pro-Trump march from November 2020 as well. And we saw a lot of this all throughout 2020. You had elections uh, coming up. You had a lot of people who felt very strongly about President Trump at the time and still do today. Um, People tend to not be neutral on Donald Trump, right? They're either adamantly pro or adamantly against, and so that was one of the big causes that we saw in 2020. Well, we also have an election coming up in 2024, but we'll talk about that in its own segment. Also in 2020, the George Floyd protests, right? Big deal. Obviously, everyone knows what happened in 2020, but you had massive social unrest due to the death of George Floyd. Um, this type of thing uh, only happens if you have a cause that hundreds of thousands or millions of people can relate to. That a major incident that lights that fire happens, like a death in the Floyd case. And you also have some underlying organizations that are more or less ready for the moment. And you had all of those factors come into play with the Floyd protests and riots in 2020. You also had what I would call the height of popularity between the far left and far right. In 2020, for example, you saw a lot of clashes between, for example, Antifa and the Proud Boys in Portland and in Seattle and other areas as well. This was an era where the far left and far right both felt that they could run amok. Both felt that they had adequate cause. Each side saw the other growing in numbers, so they did a lot of recruiting, things of that nature. Most of this started on the left as anti-Trump action, and it was responded to on the right. The right never had the numbers that the left did, but you haven't seen these far left or far right groups with that level of popularity since 2020. Once the election was over, once you had three major marches for Trump in DC, once Biden took office, post January 6th, all the events of that day, the leftist groups really kind of faded away. Now they're still there. They're still planning and organizing. Stop Cop City, right? We saw that incident happen earlier this year. But overall, 2020 was the height of popularity for these groups, right? And so that was a major factor as well. They were able to mobilize in ways we really haven't seen since at least early 2021. But looking forward to the future, we can guarantee because we've seen lots of evidence that they're getting ready for round two in 2024. Now, interestingly, statistically, there were over 7,300 total protests in 2020. 96.3 caused no property damage or police injuries, at least per UConn's research, right? Pretty heavy spike. You can see the stats there, 2019 versus 2020. Most of these were smaller and not spectacular in any way, right? Marching, protesting, signs, that kind of thing, and then everybody goes home. The ones that weren't in that category definitely weren't. They were a lot more violence and such than what America had seen really since the race riots of the 1960s. But most of them were pretty peaceful, at least again per UConn. This was also an era of kind of global anti-authority protests. The pre-COVID era saw protests in over 100 nations. They were all kind of anti-authority, anti-government in nature. So there was undercurrents globally of this dissatisfaction with authority, and the U.S. was certainly not immune to that. Now, when you're starting to kind of compare 2024 and 2020, what kind of factors do we see that are similar? Well, we do see election between the exact same candidates. We see a lot of economic uncertainty. Wall Street may be painting a rosy picture, but Main Street is not. So economic uncertainty is certainly something to keep an eye on. Traditionally, economic uncertainty and economic concerns have led to more protests globally than any social cause. Now that's shifted a little bit in recent years where social causes are kind of taking the forefront. But if we have an economic downturn in 2024, that's going to increase the odds. And you had a lot of economic uncertainty in 2020. You had the COVID pandemic taking hold and government's reactions to the COVID pandemic. That a lot of people are out of jobs. A lot of people are concerned about putting food on the table and their own well-being economically, not even to mention physically. Now, right now, there's no pandemic factor for 2024. Now, if you were sitting here in November 2019, for example, you could have said the exact same thing, or at least most people could have. We were already starting to track COVID's origination in China here at NiceBridge by then, but for the most part, folks had no idea that that was coming. Right now, that might be a big difference in 2020 and 2024. As I mentioned a little bit, the social causes have definitely changed from 2020 to 2024. There are fewer of them that it could be major sparks, like the death of George Floyd. You do have some out there, though, that have caused some pretty significant protests. One of those being abortion, of course. Once Roe versus Wade was struck down, that's a hot button topic. Whether you're on the left or the right, regardless of how you feel about the Supreme Court striking that down, it's likely that your feelings are pretty strong either direction. Typically, they are on that particular topic. You're also seeing a lot of pro gun legislation passed, and you're seeing, at least in the last year or so, the Supreme Court strike down a lot of gun control type laws. So that's another hot button topic as well, just socially. And then, of course, you're also seeing a lot of protests from the right against transgender issues and things of that nature as well. So it's not that we don't have social issues that could lead to serious protests. We do, but right now, none of them necessarily have the immediate spark factor. These are simmering things that could come to the surface in 2024. So you do have some similarities here between these 2 years that we're looking at, but there are some differences as well. So as we kind of pivot from 2020 to 2024, let's look at first the kind of the overall environment, right? There's a common mindset among Americans, what's next, right? Americans tend to always be looking forward. What's the next thing? What's the next thing? Americans tend to get bored pretty easily as well. You can see that with the war in Ukraine, for example. A lot of people are losing interest in that because there's a hot new thing going on in Gaza, right? So that's a pretty common mindset and typically leads us to a lot of causes in a short period of time, right? It's also very true that in 2024, long running trend, but Americans are being pushed into ever more polarizing positions, right? America looked very polarized in the Obama years, for example. It looked very polarized during the Bush Jr. years. None of that compares to the polarization we see today. That was a joke, right? We thought we were divided. We really weren't nearly as divided, for example, in the Bush years as we are right now in the Biden years. And a lot of that has to do with media, social media. It's just ongoing balkanization, self-balkanization, people voting with their feet and moving. Tribalization is a big thing here in 2023, looking into the next year. So that's kind of a taste of the overall environment, and that is conducive to unrest. The economic environment, we've already talked about a little bit. If you read the Global Hotspot report, you know what the economic environment is, right? There's some good news, there's some bad news, but overall, the Fed's chance of sticking a soft landing, not particularly good right now. Political environment, we'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide, but likely, if you see wide scale protest action, it's going to be more related to politics than anything else because we have election 2024. Trump and Biden once again. The rhetoric is very hostile from both sides, much more hostile, by the way, than what we saw in 2020. 2020. Rhetoric was hostile then, but it's really hostile now, right? You've got the stolen election narrative coming from the Trump camp. You've got the dark Brandon that issues that Biden is actually kind of seizing onto a little bit, kind of okay playing the villain role from time to time against the evil right wingers, et cetera. But a lot of pretty harsh rhetoric already flying back and forth. Now, Donald Trump has not fully turned his sights upon President Biden because at this time he's still dealing with DeSantis and Haley, et cetera, in the primaries. But once you've got the field eliminated, which it looks like Donald Trump will be able to do, look for the rhetoric to really skyrocket. The debates should be a lot of fun if that's your thing. Trump trials is a major factor here as well. You've got quite a few pending cases against Trump coming up in 2024. You've got one trial that looks like it's going to be taking place in March, potentially April. You've got another, they're trying to set a date of August. So one before and one after the Republican convention. That could be a major, major thing. For example, if Trump is convicted and receives some type of jail time, as he is presumably the Republican candidate, that could be a major, major spark. You could see that being something of, the Floyd level reaction on the right this time. Most of the Floyd protests were leftist in nature, but you could see something similar to that if Trump is convicted and sentenced to jail time. You could see a lot of unrest just explode across the nation. Hundreds of thousands of people scattered about and protesting. So that's a major, major factor. Also, and I actually had a question come in the chat about this, which is great because it was already in the slide. The question was, should the Israel conflict continue into the election season? Could that become a hot election issue? Yes, absolutely. It could become a huge issue. We're already seeing a lot of pro-Palestinian, pro-Gaza marchers. There have been wide-scale protests against Israel, and there have been wide-scale pro-Israel protests as well, although there have been fewer of those. But this is one of those in the United States, it's a social issue, right? In Israel and Gaza, it's much less of a social issue and more of a wartime environment. But here in the US, um, it's pretty clear that you typically have, your hardcore leftist groups that are pro-Gaza, pro-Palestine. And then you do have leftist groups that are pro-Israel, but on the right, it's either pro-Israel or none of our business, generally speaking, until you get over to the hard right, which is definitely not pro-Israel. But what you're looking at here is a situation where you're definitely going to see ongoing protests, especially on the pro-Palestinian side of things. That's not going anywhere anytime soon. And as the IDF continues its campaign in Gaza, as those images and videos continue to come out, as the propaganda wars continue, the odds of seeing significant unrest there are pretty high. That's certainly a direct factor in 2024. And here's another interesting thing. Um, Infrastructure attacks, cyber or otherwise, are always out there. But you've got a lot of posturing by China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, specifically against American infrastructure over the last year or so. Going back several years, there was always a threat of a major attack against our infrastructure, but it seemed like this in the cyber realm, it was more geared towards not sabotage, but espionage, right? Stealing corporate secrets, things of that nature. How can we obtain economic benefit from this activity, right? And that trend is changing. The trend has been changing over the last year to 2 years, where you're increasingly seeing these probing attacks focused on American infrastructure. And that's not something that's accidental, right? You don't just wake up one morning and decide, hey, let's start probing water treatment plants instead of banks. So there is kind of a wild card out there, right? Of a situation where American infrastructure is threatened and taken down in some way. We know that there are a lot of bugs in the machines, so to speak, when it comes to American infrastructure. And we know that China and Russia, at least, could take down significant amounts of American infrastructure, whether it be electrical grid, water treatment plants, communications, you name it. We are very vulnerable there. So as the world continues to kind of align with either the China-Russia side of things or the United States led order, infrastructure attacks could be the next level up, where those countries decide that they need to push back on the U.S. in a heavier way, but something short of open warfare. And infrastructure attacks would certainly accomplish that purpose. It also has some level of deniability, not total deniability. They can always point to, well, that was a rogue hacking group, and they happen to speak our language and be based in our nation, but we didn't direct them to do that. It would probably be something like that. But I think that there's an increasing risk that you do see some type of direct infrastructure attack. And if that were to happen, most likely cyber. We did see some infrastructure attacks over the last 18 months or so, shooting electrical substations, for example. And that's a small localized effect, right? But cyber attacks may not be. So throwing that in there as a direct factor, but again, still something of a wild card. It just depends on do the enemies of America want to ramp up to that level or not? Um, let's see. And going on from there, odds. So, what are the odds of those direct factors producing social unrest, right? Remember the definition of unrest in the very beginning, like wide scale protest action, some violence, things of that nature, right? Well, related to the election, the odds there are very high indeed. You're already seeing a little bit of protest action starting up, but as the picture solidifies, as we have a Republican candidate, most almost certainly to be Donald Trump at this point, facing off against Joe Biden, the resumption of 2020 level anti-Trump demonstrations should be expected, right? This is something that we should expect. When you start looking at the Trump trials, which is another factor we mentioned, moderate to high, and this is a tough one because we don't know what the outcome of those trials is going to be. We do very much believe that you're going to see marches and protests both for and against Trump around the actual trials themselves. That's very likely to take place. Whether that devolves into violence is kind of a coin flip, depending on the groups that show up that decide to take part there. But it could be very high as well, as I mentioned earlier, if Trump were to, for example, be convicted and told to, report to prison a month before the election, for example. So moderate to high on that one. You've also got social causes like Black Lives Matter, for example, which was a big deal in 2020, and they're still active, right? Social causes is high, and the reason that it's high is because all of the causes that are out there, right? We mentioned abortion, gun control, things of that nature. All of those causes are brought firmly into the consciousness of most Americans when it's an election year, when it's a presidential election year, because the candidates are talking about it, right? You can't get away from those issues when there's a presidential election going on. So all of those social causes that are out there that have caused moderate protest in 2023 are much more likely, given the overall environment, in 2024, much more likely to see larger protests, et cetera. Now, economic causes, I'm going to put this one moderate to low. And the reason that we're looking at this as moderate to low is that a couple of different things. Is one, it doesn't look likely that there's some significant economic crash, right? In 2020, for example, you saw, the stock market lose massive value in a very short period of time. People were a bit panicky. A lot of layoffs, things of that nature. Yeah, even if the U.S. enters a recession in 2024, it's not likely to be nearly as dramatic as that. And protests for economic reasons typically are pretty small unless there's a dramatic factor, unless there's something that's a real shock to the system. And while that can't be completely predicted, considering that a lot of folks' energies is going to be in the political realm and in the social cause realm, um, protests related to economic causes probably moderate to low. But when you jump over to Gaza, Palestine, Israel, it goes high. So the reason for this is that the IDF is not ending its campaign in Gaza. It's simply not going to. You are going to see a lot more images come out of bloodshed in that region. You're going to continue to see, international calls for humanitarian pauses even after the current one expires. You're going to continue to see a lot of the world be fairly critical against Israel, even as the United States officially very much supports what Israel's doing there in Gaza. Um, this is a cause that's not going to go away. There are a lot of pro-Palestinian groups, especially on college campuses, that are going to be marching. And one of the big reasons for that is that President Biden's been pretty clear about where he stands on the whole issue. He's supporting Israel. Uh, Trump, a little bit less so, but still on the more favorable side. So you're going to have those that are pro-Palestinian looking at these two candidates saying, I have no one who represents me. And typically that does lead to protests, especially on the left, who are much more adept at putting together protests than the right. So, our overall assessment, right? The odds of social unrest in the US for the year 2024 should be considered to be high. Not, it may not be Floyd level protests, right? We have 50,000 people, massive property damage, right? City blocks going up in flames, things like that. Um, Not necessarily predicting that. So something less than 2020 is the most likely scenario. The odds of protests that turn violent is virtually 100%. When you have all of these different causes and an election between candidates that are very much hated by the other side, there is going to be violence somewhere. Now, is it widespread? Probably not. But in the large cities, I think it's wise to hold the position that the odds of protest is high. There will be violence at some of these events. And maybe that's where you don't want to necessarily be, right? So, slightly less volatile situation potentially, especially earlier in the year as 2024 kicks off, right? The Trump trials haven't kicked in yet. Trump won't even be the nominee until early summer. There's a lot of these social organizations that are starting to spin up for the cycle. But when you look at protest action in January, February, and then go compare it to what it's likely to be in October, for example, there's going to be a lot more in October. Now, obviously, there's a lot of wild cards there, but generally speaking, initially a fairly calm year in 2024, and then ramping up the longer the conflict in Gaza goes, the closer we get to the election, and then the entire situation around the Republicans potentially nominating Trump as their candidate, and also his trials, right? But again, just any Floyd-like incident um, or a disputed election could lead to some massive outbursts. If you have a highly questioned election by either side that looks like it may have some legitimacy, then there's going to be massive backlash to that. So keep an eye on kind of those black swan events, Floyd-like events, or a disputed election would be game on for one side or the other, or potentially both, depending on the exact scenarios. So overall expectations here. Already mentioned slow acceleration early in the year, Um, as these situations hit, right, as the nomination process begins, as Trump trials begin, as the elections move on towards the actual day of voting, I would expect to see tensions increasing. Keep an eye on all of these factors. If you want to jump back to the beginning of the video, if you're watching this as a recording, and screenshot some of those slides to keep as a reminder to yourself of what some of the flashpoints could be and kind of when those are happening. That's not a terrible idea to go ahead and do that. If we do have significant unrest, major planned protests, major planned riots, the Knightsbridge team intends to cover those. What we've done for many years, kind of how we got started as an organization, was covering these types of events, major riots, major protests, and really getting at the ground truth of what was truly happening in those situations and in those environments. And so we intend to do that again in 2024, as our projections are that it's going to be a rather spicy year for that type of thing. So look for after action reports and some real-time reporting as those incidents unfold. This is another reason why you should definitely follow us on Twitter, by the way. Speaking of which, this is our information, web, email, and Twitter. I'm looking for comments. I don't see any coming in related to the closer look. So if there are no comments, once again, we appreciate everyone being here. Thank you very much for your subscription as we approach Thanksgiving tomorrow. Let me just say that we are thankful and grateful for every single one of you, and we would welcome feedback. Feel free to reach out to us via any of these methods here with feedback, positive or negative, and we will happily accept that. So, once again, have a great week. Enjoy your Thanksgiving holiday, and we will see you next week.